Well, let's get more analysis now. We can speak to Greg Treverton, who's a former chairman of the U.S. National Intelligence Council under President Barack Obama and a senior foreign policy expert who joins us now from Costa Rica. Thank you very much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. We've heard this change of venue has been announced. The talks between the Americans and the Iranians will not be happening in Turkey. They are set to happen in Oman. And we're also hearing about Iran framing these negotiations as being solely about the nuclear program and not about the other issues that the Americans wanted to discuss. How do you think that's going to go down with President Trump?
We'll see. He's so unpredictable. We just can't know, I think. Happily, so far, he's avoided any further military options, and that the United States is willing to sit down, even under Mr. Trump, with Iran, I think is a very good sign. The Iranians obviously want to confine the negotiations as much as they can. We'd like to expand them. For me, starting with the nuclear issue, which is in some ways maybe the hardest issue, is probably not a bad place to start. So I hope that the change in venue will indicate a fresh start, perhaps on both sides, and that the Iranians are willing to talk about the nuclear issue, I think is a good sign. It probably also reflects how bad their circumstances are, but reaching out and being willing to talk, I think, is at least a good beginning.
Right, but those talks are not like previous rounds of talks in Oman. Those talks will be taking place in the context of massive US military presence and firepower in the region. How does that change the dynamic?
Well, I think it certainly drives home to Iran what difficult circumstances they're in. They've lost all their proxies and allies. They themselves have been badly beaten by the airstrikes. The good news, at least from my perspective, is that there really aren't, given all that force, it's really a show of force. There aren't any attractive military options. If you want to try and degrade the military, you could do some of that. If you want to try and further degrade the nuclear sites, you could do that. That's probably unnecessary. We've seen no sign that Iran is really working at breakneck speed to try and reconstruct the nuclear program. And if you tried to do something about the forces of security and order, you'd end up killing lots of innocent Iranians. So I hope this reflects understanding by the Trump administration that there really are no attractive military options, that show of force may be helpful, maybe cowing the Iranians a little bit, or at least reminding them how weak their position is, but to actually use that force seems to be extremely counterproductive.
Well, I mean, maybe Iran needs to hear that, because Iran, there have been two incidents in the last 24 hours. The Iranians fired a drone in the direction of the USS Abraham Lincoln. That's an aircraft carrier. They also approached a US-flagged tanker. I mean, they're playing with fire here, aren't they?
Absolutely, because there is all that military force. While there are no good military options, there's certainly plenty of damage the United States could do. My concern is almost any damage would probably strengthen the regime rather than weaken it, as nations typically rally behind the flag when they're attacked. So this is a nice reminder, and obviously the Iranians want to show that they're not entirely powerless, that they do have some options, but so far so good, at least from my perspective. Get the talk started and actually go somewhere, that would be really very, very welcome news in a region from which there hasn't been much welcome news in the last few years.
And also, I mean, the Iranians must be mindful of the fact that this is the same president that killed or ordered the killing of Qasem Soleimani. He also joined the 12-day Israeli bombing campaign back in June and struck those nuclear sites in Iran. I mean, this is a president, isn't it, that does what he says he's going to do?
Mostly he does what he says he's going to do. Sometimes he, as they sometimes he does taco, but chicken out. I hope this is one of those, because it seems to be, as I said earlier, there really aren't any good military options. Almost anything that the United States could do would either increase support for the regime or kill a lot of innocent Iranians. And that seems like not a good position to be in. The show of force is great, reminds the Iranians what their position is, But actually using that force now would be, in my view, a grave error.
But we've seen in recent months, well, in the last 18 months, I should say, really, but we've seen examples time and time again of Israeli, in particular, intel being used to pinpoint exactly where specific individuals are. So if very carefully executed surgical strikes were carried out, I mean, could they take out the leadership without any collateral damage if they wanted to?
Good question. I think no one quite knows the answer. Certainly the Israelis have shown remarkable clandestine abilities in recent years. I think if there were some way to take out the Ayatollah Khamenei, the supreme leader, in a discreet and not huge damage way, certainly I think probably both the United States and Israel would be prepared to do that. Whether we have the capacity, just not clear. Certainly Israel has shown amazing capacities with cell phones, with pagers, with all kinds of devices that they turned into lethal weapons. So I think the answer is we don't know, but my guess is that if we had that capacity, either the United States or Israel, more likely Israel, that would be an option that I think would tempt Mr. Trump. After all, he did take out a major figure a couple of years ago, and so I think he would do it again if he had the chance.
Okay, I mean, just before we move on to Ukraine very quickly, I mean, are you concerned about the risk of a miscalculation? I mean, tempers are flaring, tensions are high, and we've got some pretty unpredictable individuals in the mix here.
Yes, that's always the worry. I think the chance of a miscalculation is you've got that much force, with the Iranians feeling like they have to save face at least by occasionally launching a drone or making a pass at a U.S. ship, a U.S. flagged ship. There's always that chance. With such force in the region, the chances of a miscalculation seem to me to be great. They always are in these circumstances, but in this case, with all that's passed before and the huge show of force the United States is amassing, the chances of something by accident, I think, have gone up, and that is obviously a very great worry. It makes it, I think, all the more important that the talks begin, that there be some communication. I assume we've been communicating, the United States, been communicating indirectly with Iran throughout this crisis, but those are more and more important channels as we do come to a position where we really risk the chance of a major war by accident.
Okay, just moving on briefly to Ukraine. Talks are taking place as we speak, trilateral talks involving the Americans, the Russians, and the Ukrainians. Do you see this dialogue delivering results where previous rounds of dialogue have not?
It's hard to be optimistic, I think. You know, that the sides are still pretty far apart. The only thing I think that has changed is it does seem like, against their will, the Ukrainians have come closer to accepting they may have to concede some territory. And since that has been a major sticking point, along with what kind of security guarantees Ukraine would get, maybe there's some ground for a little bit of optimism. But there's not really much sign that Putin has retreated from his pretty maximalist aims. He promised some ceasefire against infrastructure, did it briefly, but then has returned to massive strikes on Kyiv and Ukrainian infrastructure in the very cold winter. So it's hard to be very optimistic. I suppose the only grounds for optimism is this is the first time recently we've had all three sides together. So that's at least talking. As a famous American Secretary of State once said, better to jaw than war. And let us hope a little jawing can lead to at least a ceasefire.
But I mean, it doesn't look like the Russians are in a particularly strong negotiating position when you consider that they have managed to gain, I think it said, 1.5% more Ukrainian territory since the start of 2024. They're not really making lightning speed advances, are they? And I'm just wondering whether that does mean that they're going into these negotiations with a little bit less momentum and a bit less of a position of strength than they would do if the opposite was true.
Yeah, I think so. I think that is right. The Russians have gained steadily, but not very much, and at a huge price. I think that circumstance is more or less the same as it's been before, right? With Ukrainians holding on bravely, the Russians making slight advances at huge cost. Whether or not the prospect of some surrender of territory by Ukraine will lead Putin to say enough is enough, just hard to know. He has held throughout to pretty maximalist objectives.
Okay, we really appreciate you taking the time to speak to us. Greg Treverton, former chairman of the U.S. National Intelligence Council under President Barack Obama. Thank you very much indeed for your time, sir. Well, to discuss this further, I'm joined here in the studio by Greg Swenson, who is the chair of Republicans Overseas. Greg, great pleasure having you here with us here in the studio. Let's start by talking about the latest we've heard on these talks. The venue appears to have changed. It's no longer going to happen in Istanbul. The talks are going to happen in Oman. And it's easy to see why, from Iran's perspective, that they'd want that change of venue. So they can frame the conversation as being a continuation of previous dialogue and avoid any expansion of the scope of the talks from nuclear issues. Is that your understanding?
Yeah, I think that's the way I see it, is in the sense that, Oman was the moderator and also the location of many of the talks for the JCPOA, which was a complete failure. So I'm not sure why the U.S. would agree to that, but maybe that was just some of the horse trading that went on. So they do have a history of mediating between the U.S. and Iran. But the challenge, and they've done a good job actually getting some hostages released, so I give them credit for that. This goes back 10 years. But I do think that the implication that this will just be about the nuclear weapon negotiations, I think, is a big mistake, and I don't think the U.S. will tolerate that. There has to be discussions about guided missile systems. There's got to be discussions about funding the proxy terrorist groups, and of course discussions about killing their own people that are protesting in Iran.
Right, so they've got lots to talk about, and Iran is saying we only want to talk about nuclear issues. Right. Changing the venue at the last minute, firing a drone in the direction of the USS Abraham Lincoln. I mean, do you see a point? I mean, you know President Trump. Do you see a point where he'll lose patience?
Of course, yeah, I do. And I think he wants to give them the off-ramp. He tried that with last summer before the U.S. bombed and sent the B-2s in. He's tried it so often. He even tried it with Maduro in Venezuela last month. And so it's a shame. But if they keep at this, and if they refuse to talk about the things that need to be discussed, yeah, the president will be pushed to use military force. He's not afraid to do that. He'd rather not, though.
Because, I mean, these talks, pretending that they're an extension of the previous talks in Oman, is to ignore the fact that there is a huge U.S. flotilla in just off the Straits of Hormuz. Yeah. I mean, they seem to be in denial.
And the U.S. has already dealt with the nuclear weapon threat. We did that in June, and essentially it either devastated it or eliminated it. Even the mullahs admit that, the regime. And so, yeah, this has to be about the missile systems, and it has to be about killing their own people and the protests and some kind of reform. And the alternative is the president sends in the B-2s again, and we've got a carrier, off the coast of Oman right now. And I think the alternative is complete regime change. So if I were the regime, I would start to play nice. I think it was a big mistake sending that drone toward the Lincoln yesterday.
Right. I mean, how does the U.S. respond to that?
Well, they eliminated the drone, but there was no retaliation. They just eliminated the threat using an F-35 off of the Abraham Lincoln. But I do think that was reckless by the regime. But I think the U.S. deliberately chose not to escalate with the talks being on Friday. So, I mean, good for them for not escalating. But anything more than that, and I think it will be a massive threat to the regime.
There seems to be a real gap in expectations about these talks on Friday. Iran saying we won't make any concessions, talking about what it considers to be red lines. Right, we're not talking about those other issues that you want to talk about. I mean, do you think the talks can actually go ahead?
I think they can go ahead. I think there'll at least be an effort. But if they remain, belligerent like this, there'll be nothing productive that will come of them. I mean, they were they were completely defenseless when the U.S. went in last summer and took out the nuclear weapon facilities. You saw it in Venezuela, where the absolutely flawless execution with Russian defense systems. There are really no defense systems that either the Israelis already took them out or they're just not effective. And so this would be a very one-sided conflict. I'm not suggesting that we want that, and I know that we of course don't want war. But the Iranian people are suffering. The regime has been at war with America for 47 years, and they've killed more Americans than any other source globally, over the last 2 decades. So, I think there's a point where, again, we don't want regime change. We surely don't want boots on the ground, but I don't think it's a fair fight either. So I think the regime is really playing with fire here.
Right, and in Washington, they're presumably making various calculations, and there are two starkly different arguments, aren't there? Strike the leadership, and perhaps that'll have the effect of bringing people out on the street, and it will weaken the leadership, or it'll galvanize nationalist-type support for the leadership. Which of those scenarios do you think is more likely?
I think it's much more the former. I mean, we've seen that with the protests, and even groups, the protests started with the shopkeepers in the markets, and those were typically people that supported the regime. So things have really changed. This is an economic revolution in many ways, with the economic misery they're suffering. So I don't think that there would be much support, and I think even now, there are people that probably just stay out of the politics, and especially if you're making money. But most of the people would, I think, be very comfortable with some sort of regime change. What that is the difficult challenge. And so we surely don't want to have a vacuum there. And we saw that with Iraq, and we saw that with Afghanistan. So, there are nerves. There's some scar tissue because of the forever wars and the regime change wars. And I think, many Americans are very averse to that on both the right and the left. But this is one where it checks a lot of boxes. It's an enemy of the United States. It's aligned with China and Russia and other bad actors, and they've been really disruptive by supporting their terrorist proxy groups. There's many reasons, on top of the fact that the Iranian people are suffering here.
What do you think President Trump's advisors are telling him at the moment? Do you think they're speaking with one voice, or do you think they're going to be louder voices like, for example, Steve Witkoff, who's just been holding talks with the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu? Yeah. We can assume his line of argument will be much more act now.
Well, there could be some diplomacy. I mean, the president and his team prefer diplomacy, and I think Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner have done a phenomenal job in several different places. But there is a moment where the red line's been crossed, and it has, because they were killing their own people. And that was a line that the president drew. So at some point, there might have to be some military action. Again, he's done this before. He prefers diplomacy and make money, not war. He'd rather use economic coercion if that's necessary, and military action is a last resort. But when they do it really well.
Right, and this is a president that Iran knows better than anyone means what he says. We saw that in June.
Yeah.
I mean, this is a president who will not hesitate, as he did with Qasem Soleimani as well.
That's right.
To take action.
Yeah, absolutely. And al-Baghdadi, prior to that. And so, he did it in Syria. He had 300 Russian mercenaries were killed at his command. So, this is a president he's a peace president. He's anti-war. He does not want to use force. But when challenged and when it's for the greater good, he will use force.
What do you think America's desired outcome is here, just to sort of wrap up?
I think the end of the regime. This has been 47 years. It started with, capturing American hostages, and it's been a disaster from the start for not only for the Iranian people, who are great people, and the president loves them. I think he's using gunboat diplomacy. He's using peace through strength because that's what he wants. But again, he really cares about the Iranian people. I could see a Trump Tower in Tehran in 10 years or 5 years, maybe sooner. But I think, he always prefers economic coercion. But if he has to do it, I think Americans will support it because of the regime being in place for 47 years, having done very little good for anybody. Not only, killing their own people or causing the suffering for their own population, but what they've done with Hezbollah and the Houthis and Hamas and you know, the general disruption here in the region.
Now, another issue that is very much on the president's radar is the situation in Ukraine, and a second round of trilateral US-brokered talks is taking place more or less as we speak. Presumably President Trump is exasperated
Yeah.
12 months into his presidency. There isn't yet a solution.
Yeah, I mean, you know, A for effort, right? He's trying, he hoped he could do it a lot faster. The loose cannon here is Putin, and that's been the real wild card. And Putin, you know, really has never honestly negotiated. You know, even when he feigned it or sent some people to the negotiating table, he wasn't sincere about it. The Russians are suffering right now. The Russian people are. The economy is in really bad shape. The outcomes on the battlefield are not great. I think, as usual, you know, a day or two before they sit down for negotiations, he fires a bunch of, you know, missiles into Kyiv. It's really sad to see. That's just maybe the signs of a desperate person. I mean, it is. They are not. They maybe make 70 meters a week of progress on the ground war. They're not doing very well,
right.
And they can't keep up the production that they saw. And Iran is not able to support them like they were, because Iran's been devastated in terms of the military. So this is a weakened Putin right now. So I would think, you know, he should not be feared. He should be marginalized. But we'll see.
Right, in Iran, of course, a major supplier of those Shahed drones. I think, in fact, the statistic that I found was that Russia has managed to take about 1.5% more territory incrementally since the start of 2024. So they're not really going to these talks in a position of strength, are they?
No, not at all. And they've you know, over 1 million casualties, 350,000 dead soldiers, and at some point, you know, that's more than they lost in all of their other conflicts after World War II. I mean, think about the U.S. lost 56,000 men and women in Vietnam. They lost roughly 30,000 in Korea. 350,000, that's a number, and that has to start to hurt in terms of support in Russia.
Right. I mean, just to wrap up, I mean, the talks are ongoing.
Yeah.
Steve Witkoff and Jared Kushner giving it their all. Territory still the sticking point, we're told. That's like the only sticking point, but it has been now for quite some time. Russia is saying to Ukraine, hand over the whole of the Donbass, and yet Moscow's forces haven't even managed to take control of all of the Donbass. So can you imagine a scenario in which the US says, yeah, actually, you should give up the whole of the Donbass?
Yeah, I think, look, I think Zelensky's been pretty cooperative with the president, you know, and I think they want peace, and there's going to be some concessions on both sides that people are going to be unhappy with, especially the Ukrainians. But I think there's support for that, and the polls of the Ukrainian people right now are suggesting they are completely comfortable with some concessions, some more land concessions. They just want to end this war. They don't want defeat. They don't want to roll over, and they've been very brave in what they've done. It's actually quite amazing what Ukraine has been able to do. And again, I think it shows the weakness of Russia. For all this talk about NATO and you know, his threat to other NATO or to NATO countries, it's just amazing that the Ukrainians have been able to hold on for 4 years now.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there because we're out of time, but thank you very much indeed for coming in to see us. Greg Watson, Chair of Republicans Overseas. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Tom.